This podcast is brought to you by North Carolina's electric cooperatives.
This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Welcome to Balanced Debate for the Old North State. The table is set for the 2018 elections as the candidate filing period ended Wednesday. So we begin to talk about who's in, who's out, and what we can expect. The subject of hacking or tampering with elections has occupied national attention, and the executive director of the State Board of Elections want to take steps to make sure it's not a problem in North Carolina. This past week, legislators grew more insistent on finding solutions to make our prisons safer, and we'll discuss some of them. And after so much heavy discussion, we switch gears and ask our panel to tell us what they believe is North Carolina's biggest political problem, if we have the time. And of course, we promise not to end until we ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. Joining us on this week's panel are Rick Henderson, editor-in-chief of the Carolina Journal, Chris Fitzsimon, political analyst and columnist, John Hood, syndicated columnist and author, and Brad Crone, political and communications consultant. We begin our uninterrupted debate after these brief messages by our underwriters.
From treating the newest member of your family to helping a loved one make end-of-life decisions, your family physician is with you every step, for every stage of life, for every member of your family. Despite a healthcare landscape fraught with potential landmines, family physicians across North Carolina are providing you a lifetime of committed, dependable medical care. Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisor for life.
Agriculture. It's North Carolina's #1 economic driver. It puts people to work. It powers our economy. And as agriculture grows, so does our quality of life. North Carolina Farm Bureau is proud to support agriculture and our farmers because agriculture connects us all.
Let's get started. The deadline to file in the 2018 elections ended Wednesday at noon. We've got a soup to nuts preview for you this week. For the first time in anyone's history, we've got a choice in all 170 seats in the North Carolina General Assembly in the November elections. Brad Crone, can you tell us why all 170 seats are being contested? Is it because there's more interest this year, a more heightened political environment, because of changed legislative districts and all the news about gerrymandering? Because the parties have been more active in recruiting, or what?
Yes, all of them, Tom.
All the above.
All of the above. I will say both parties did an excellent job in the last quarter of really going out and recruiting candidates. They wanted to make sure that all the races in the state, both parties, were contested, and that for incumbents who had safe seats, they wanted to have candidates to lock them down and keep them at home so that they wouldn't be able to take money from their district and play at the state party level for both the Democrats and the Republicans.
Interesting.
Now, while we've got 170 contests, only 20 to 25 of them will be super competitive.
Yeah. John, the traditional thinking has been that the party out of power always gains seats during off-year elections, which means in North Carolina, Democrats should be poised to gain some seats in the legislature and perhaps maybe even in Congress. You wrote a column this week in which you said not so fast on that. Explain it.
The historical pattern would suggest the Democrats have an edge. There are some other signs that show Democrats are in good shape as a party out of power in a midterm election. But there are also some countervailing signals that point to a more competitive situation for the Republicans. They're going to have a fundraising advantage. They have recruited good candidates. Brad said it isn't just the Democrats who have a lot of energized, excited candidates. Both sides have it. And also the three most recent statewide polls that asked generic ballot questions for either congressional or legislative races or both showed it tied. Typically in a midterm election where the Republicans have a little bit of an edge turnout-wise, the Democrats have a good cycle when they have a significant advantage in the ballot test. Right now, that's not evident. I'm not saying it won't show up by the fall, but this is not looking right now. The signs do not necessarily all point to a Democratic way.
You're not seeing a Democratic surge. When we were talking last week or a couple weeks ago, that was true, and those were the latest North Carolina polls, and nationally the generic ballot had tightened. In the last week or so, we've seen the generic ballot widen significantly, and the Democrats have a big advantage. It will be interesting to see the new statewide polls in North Carolina. And the second thing I think is really important to remember why both parties now work so hard to get everybody on the ballot. In 1994, seems like forever ago, it was, I think, a wave election that caught a lot of people by surprise. There were Republican candidates who were elected who literally put their name on the ballot. That happens once in a blue moon. I'm not saying it's going to happen this year. There's always a chance it could happen, and that's why it's so important for both parties to have a name on the line.
Rick, we talked about the fact that all 170 seats are contested in November, but 95 of the 120 House seats are uncontested in the primary, 92 of which were Republicans. In the Senate, 39 Democrats and 38 Republicans have no opposition in the primaries. What is that saying to you?
Well, what it basically says is that, especially for incumbents, they're going to have a very good shot at getting reelected. What it also says is that it's very difficult to find credible candidates to run against incumbents. It's a real tough job. For one thing, it's difficult to convince people to spend, all their time in Raleigh basically for a
$13,000 a year job.
And even if they're going to all the committee meetings and stuff like that, you're talking about maybe $30,000, $40,000. It's tough to convince people to run against an incumbent when those are the stakes, unless the incumbent happens to have some real problems.
All right, let's get into the Brad. You were going to.
I think Rick's absolutely right. I agree with John and Chris in the sense the bottom has to fall out.
This week.
Well, I think they all make very valid points. In the polling data that's out there right now, you see a ripple, not a wave. If there's a wave, it'll be in two counties, in Wake County and in Mecklenburg County, because of the density of Democrats and the energy there in the metropolitan regions. There are two demographics that you really got to watch out for, though. It's your unaffiliated voter in the state and older white Democrats in suburban and rural counties.
And we might just go ahead and note the fact that unaffiliated and independent candidates have much longer to wait to have to file to run in these races. So,
correct.
Yeah, so under the circumstances, we might see some more candidates there. All right, let's tee off and hit these legislative races. And I'm just going to open the table and let anybody who wishes talk about some of the primary contests that you feel might be interesting to watch. John, let's start with you.
Well, I think the Senate has perhaps a few more interesting primaries than the House, and I'll mention a couple of them to start out with. One of them is right in the northeast corner. It's an open seat. Bob Steinberger, who's a House member, is running for that Senate District 1 against Clark Twitty. It appears to be very competitive. There's some debates about ideology, solar energy, fisheries, lots of issues. The other thing I want to mention, lots of people have talked about the fact that Bob Rucho, who was a longtime state senator from Mecklenburg County, then he left, retired, went on the UNC Board of Governors, but now has filed again at a different seat, which is a seat that is sort of to the north and west of Charlotte.
Is this state ready for Rucho 2.0?
Well, I just want to point out that there are three other candidates in this race, and they are all well known. A.J. Dowd is a longtime Republican activist. Bill Howell's on the school board in the county. Vicki Sawyer's on the Iredell Planning Board. This is a very competitive race.
And by the way, I need to tell the viewers, you will notice if you've watched this show, I don't usually allow the panelists to have papers in front of them. This is a fairly complicated and detailed subject.
We want to say the right words with the right names and the right districts.
I got it.
474 candidates.
Brad, let's stay with the Senate. Any races you're watching?
Well, on the Democratic side, I think down in Senate District 21 in Cumberland County, incumbent Senator Ben Clark's facing a challenge from his left from Dr. Naveed Aziz. She ran last year. She's got support with liberal activists within the party. I think it's going to be an intriguing primary to watch.
All right. Chris, any of you watching in the Senate?
Yeah, I think Brad mentioned Wake and Mecklenburg counties will be the battlegrounds. Senate District 16, which is in Wake County, is a significantly Democratic district. I don't think the Republican has much of a chance, but there's a heated Democratic primary. Wiley Nickel and Lewis Toledo are both running in that primary. And
is that Chad Barefoot's seat that he's vacating?
No, that's not Chad Barefoot's seat. Chad Barefoot's seat is another one. That's 18, which is an interesting general election. This one, there is no, as several people have pointed out, there's no Latino member of the General Assembly. Lewis Toledo would be the first one.
All right. Rick?
We've got some double-bunked senators on the Republican side. District 31, which is basically slightly west of Forsyth County. You've got Dan Barrett, who was appointed to replace Andrew Brock, Davie County, running against Joyce Kravick, and that is going to be an interesting one because Kravik's been there for a while. Dan Barrett's relatively new, but he represents more of the area. Then in 45, you got Deanna Ballard versus Shirley Randleman, and this, again, double bunked. They each represent about half the people in that current district, and so it should be a fairly safe Republican district, but it's going to be one in which the primary is going to be fascinating.
All right. I want to add real quick to what Rick just said about that Kravik versus Barrett race in 31. There's a third candidate, Peter Antonozzi. He ran before against Kravik. He's a Wake Forest professor. He's in Forsyth County. I want everybody to remember that the threshold for passing the bar, not the legal bar, but to get the nomination is now 30%. So you've got two candidates in Forsyth, you've got them, Dan Barrett and Davey. This is why multiple candidate races, more than two candidate races, are very interesting to watch.
All right, let's move. Another repeat in the Senate, though, is Toby Fitch 2.0.
Right. Yes.
And you've got to be an old
Stepping down from being a judge.
Yes, Superior Court judge. He had to retire, mandatory retirement. But for anybody who's old enough to remember Toby Fitch in the House, getting Toby Fitch in the state Senate will be an entertaining show, to say the least.
That reminds me of another comeback.
With his former boss, Dan Blue.
Yeah. Well, it reminds me of another potential comeback. Some longtime viewers will remember Mark McDaniel, who was a Republican senator from Guilford County. He was the caucus chairman for the Republicans at one point. He's coming out of political retirement to run against John Hardister in House 59. This is a Guilford County seat. There's, I think, another
bringing
candidate.
Some of these guys back? I mean, why
well,
are
in the
they
case of
doing
McDaniel, he's arguing that the Republicans shouldn't have expanded the sales tax. So sometimes it's specific issues. Sometimes it's, hey, this is an exciting year. It's a blue moon election where the turnout is difficult to predict. There's lots of people putting their name on the ballot, as Chris says, and sort of hoping it works out.
I think. All right, let's move to the House. Chris, let's start with you with some House seats.
Well, House District 2, Darrell Moss is running against Larry Yarborough.
This is Steinberg's seat?
No, this is Steinberg. That's the Steinberg seat. No, the Steinberg seat is in the Northeast.
Okay.
Darrell Moss has been the former mayor who's run several times against Larry Randall. Right. I think that'll be a very interesting race.
All right.
House District 111, the Speaker's District in Kings Mountain and in Shelby, facing a Democratic challenger. Doesn't have a primary, but the Democratic challenger is a former educator, apparently a multimillionaire, and is telling folks in Cleveland County he's all in, putting his dollars in to keep the speaker right there.
All right, let's stay with primaries if we can. Other House seats?
I've got House 80. This is in the Triad area, Davidson County area. It's an open seat that Roger Yunts is running, and he did serve in the House before and then work for the Speaker. That's against Steve Jarvis, who is a county commissioner there. So that'll be a competitive Republican primary. There's also a Republican primary in House 14. This is Onslow County. George Cleveland has been there many, many terms, but he has a challenger, Joe McLaughlin, who's a former Onslow County commissioner. He formerly ran for Congress, you might remember. And so it's, I think, at least a spirited primary in that heavily Republican district.
Rick?
Actually, the only other one that I was mentioning was going to be back to the Senate again, and that was Andy Wells, Catawba County, who has three challengers, if I'm not mistaken. Andy Wells has been very strong about opposing incentives, opposing special tax breaks, and the people there in that district are saying he's not doing enough to direct business to Catawba County. And so he's running as a very sort of down the line, straight no incentive conservative, and he's taking
other House races.
I think we have to bring up the Democratic primary in House District 11, which is Wake County. Dwayne Hall, the governor of his party, has called for him to resign because of sexual misconduct allegations. The House Minority Leader has called for it. Other members of the Wake County delegation. He has two primary candidates, both women who filed at the last minute. There's been some rumors around I don't think had any idea this was happening. They were going to run anyway. I'm not sure either one of those has enough support at the moment, so we'll see what happens.
Well, so legally now, if Hall pulls out, withdraws, then it's between the other two?
That's right. There are two candidates who have filed.
Well, if he resigns, the Democratic committee would appoint a replacement to serve for the short session going into the election.
Looking beyond the primary, I think the big question on most people's minds in the 2018 elections is, can the Democrats win enough seats, probably not to take control of either house, but to blunt the veto-proof majorities? In the House, Republicans have a 75-45 plurality. In the Senate, it's 35-15. What's your, as you look at it this moment, what's your take on whether or not they can blunt those veto-proof majorities?
It is certainly possible. As we've said before, it's historically precedented in the sense that I went back and looked at the midterm elections where you had a Republican president and a Democratic governor, and the average loss of seats for the party in the White House in that scenario was about 9 seats. If you exclude an outlier. And in general, we have midterm elections that swing in the 9 to 11 seat range. That's possible, though, as we said, it's just too early to know whether the ripple becomes a wave.
Let's move over to the congressional filings, because all the incumbents filed to run again, but there's some interesting races taking place, particularly with, for instance, in the 3rd District. Which is Walter Jones's district.
Walter Jones, and that's going to be a real Donnybrook. And Dacey has more money than Congressman Jones does right now. Has started television advertising and digital advertising, so he has a clear advantage. Doug Raymond is working for, our friend Doug Raymond's working for Walter Jones. I've always said Walter, when you look at the polling numbers on Walter, his name ID's 83–84% in the district, job approval ratings around 73. I've always said Walter Jones is tough as train smoke.
Yeah, not only tough as trains, your euphemisms. The other part of it is add Doug Raymond to the mix, one of the best political minds, I think, in North Carolina. All right, over in the 9th District, Robert Pittenger's got another race from Mark Harris.
That's right, and this will be a rematch. Mark Harris, who's a minister and he ran for Senate before. He's got some name recognition statewide and has even some national connections. Robert Pittenger, formerly state Senate, now in the Congress for several terms. That was a narrow win by Pittenger in the 2016 Republican primary.
300 votes.
143.
134.
Yeah, very small number of votes. And remember also that district is very strange. It has big sort of silk stocking districts, as they used to call them in Mecklenburg County, and then it swings all the way across the North Carolina, South Carolina, and all the way down into the Sandhills. So Mark Harris could surprise Pittenger in this district.
The Democrats believe that primary fight is going to set up a battle for Dan McGready, who's a very young, attractive
Other
candidate.
congressional races you think would be interesting?
If it is a once-in-a-lifetime election, I think George Holding is the only other possibility because he's in Wake County primarily. The Democrats have a primary. The 2 leading candidates, Ken Romley and former Lieutenant Governor candidate and legislator Linda Coleman.
I think there's a possibility that you're going to see something interesting in the 13th with Ted Budd, because this is his first attempt at re-election. And Kathy Manning, who's a Greensboro philanthropist, her husband is involved in development there. She's already raised about $700,000.
That's not in the primary.
That's the general election.
That's general election.
Well, we still might want to mention that Patrick McHenry, who is the chief deputy whip in the U.S. House of Representatives, has 4 Republican primary challengers.
He always gets challenges.
Now again, 30% threshold is probably his best friend.
All right, we can't talk about elections without discussing the convincing evidence the Russians have tried to influence the 2016 elections and may have actually hacked into the databases of at least 6 states. Kim Strzok, the director of the North Carolina State Elections Board, noted no evidence of hacking was found in our state, but she said there's potential that our state election system could be compromised, and she's asking the legislature to provide more money for greater security. Rick Henderson, among Strzok's recommendation is a more secure electronic transmission system for overseas and absentee ballots, criminal background checks for election workers, and a law making it a misdemeanor for anyone other than a county elections employee to copy records that has a voter's personal information. What do you think of her recommendation?
I think she's got some sound ones there, because certainly you want to do what you can to make sure that anything done electronically is very secure. You could have a situation in which someone not only doesn't hacks into it, but you could have some sort of compromise of data, and that's always a potential problem. The criminal background checks for election workers, could be a little bit troubling, because as you well know, everywhere that you have an election cycle, the boards of elections are desperate to get people to work the polls, and they have problems getting volunteers. And even if temporary workers are expected to go through criminal background checks, that might scare some folks off.
It might scare some folks off, but it might make them safer, mightn't it?
It's possible that it would do that.
Yeah, it's possible. Other suggestions she has. What about this subject of electronic? I'm sorry to cut you off.
Well, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think that most of the recommendations are sound, but if we were in a rational country, the President of the United States would be making this a national emergency, and the federal government would be stepping in with guidelines, with support, with money for not just federal elections, but the state governments need help. I think this is this is literally a crisis. We have a foreign power, maybe more than one, who are trying to play games with our elections.
All right, we remember years and years and years ago, we pushed our counties and the election boards to go to electronic voting machines. Right. Now we're seeing their problems, and some of these machines are pretty darn old, and there is some talk about going back to paper ballots. Any chance of that?
Well, I agree with paper ballots, but I think you can scan it and have security. I think the real fear is the connection back to the modem, Tom.
All right. I can't, this has been an interesting conversation, and I'm sorry, but it's gotten to the point where I need to pivot myself to the show. Topic that everybody talks to me about. I was speaking to a Rotary Club in Cary this week, and somebody raised their hands and told me this was their favorite. Chris, tell me something we don't know.
Well, I don't know if it'll happen or not, but there is a rumor around Raleigh that a former member of Congress might actually throw his hat in the ring in a General Assembly race, and somebody might withdraw. I'll let people try to figure out who that is, but I think that is a fairly strong rumor in the
Say that
East.
again now?
A former member of Congress is being urged to run for the North Carolina General Assembly. There's a person that's in the race as a placeholder. I don't know if this is going to happen or not, but it is a rumor out there. We'll see if it happens.
How does that work when the filing is already?
Well, if the placeholder resigns, then that person is named to take that person's place on the ballot.
County party?
Right, by the party.
Rick Henderson, tell us something we don't know.
We've been talking a lot in recent weeks about school safety and school violence and preventing that. Rockingham County is the first county that has actually started a volunteer school resource officer program. They announced it this past week. Counties have been able to do that since 2013, but nobody stepped forward. But Rockingham County did it this week, and we'll see how that works for them. The schools that don't have assigned officers can have volunteers who would be trained by law enforcement.
Brad Crone, tell us something we don't know.
Elizabeth, too, is back in the water in Manio Harbor. She was hauled out in January and February for work to replace the wood along the water line, and now she's back in the harbor ready for summer vacations.
Has it been that long? It was 1984 when we commissioned the Elizabeth II for the 400th anniversary.
And the craftsman, the master carpenter who built it, has been coming back and forth from Booth Bay, Maine, to service the boats. The crews have been coming back from Maine who built the boat in 1982.
Princess Anne came over and christened that boat. I did a live statewide live radio broadcast.
It's a great exhibit. People should go see it.
I understand that. John, tell us something we don't know.
President Trump has been promising, or maybe threatening, to raise tariffs on steel and aluminum. We have a few steel production jobs in North Carolina, but this will be devastating for many more jobs in North Carolina that work in industries that use steel or aluminum as inputs. I mean, we make buses and trucks, we make steel bars, we make all sorts of things for construction purposes. And so this tariff war that is theoretically going to happen, North Carolinians have an interest in it, and it's to avoid it. It would be, particularly if countries retaliate, as they've done in the past with steel tariffs, by going after some of our agricultural or textile exports.
All right, I've got one this week. There are a lot of people around Raleigh in the state government area that are kind of reeling when they learned that the Department of Cultural Resources summarily dismissed 2 high-level workers in state government this week. The deputy director for parks and the deputy director for historic sites were just dismissed immediately, told to clear out their desk and leave. Nobody in state government can get an answer as to exactly what happened there. I know that Carolina Journal has done some reporting on it. WRAL has done some reporting on it. No answers are forthcoming. Okay, got a minute or so left. I want to go around the table very quickly. Tell me what you think is the biggest political problem in North Carolina today. John Hood.
Well, this may be a surprising answer, but I believe it is the downsizing of our news organizations. We've been watching this in the major metropolitan areas, but also in the smaller cities, the community papers, the small town daily papers. There simply aren't enough people actually reporting on the political news. Who runs? I mean, they will list candidates' names, but there isn't any story about who they are. This is a serious problem.
And Elon Poll just recently reaffirmed this when they demonstrated that more people know the name of the quarterback for the Carolina Panthers than know either one of our state senators. problematic. That's not. By the way, read my column this week on our website. I talk about it more.
Tom, I think the biggest political issue facing the state's the growing divide between rural North Carolina and metropolitan North Carolina, and the economic power and growth you're seeing in Mecklenburg, Guilford, and Wake County versus the problems you're seeing in Bertie County and Clay County.
The urban-rural
divide it's a huge divide, and we've got to find some policies to.
Rick Henderson, what do you see as the biggest political problem in North Carolina?
I think the biggest political problem we have is that too much of our lives revolve around politics. And as John said, with the lack of transparency and lack of local coverage, people don't know what's going on in politics. And our culture, our churches, everything has become politicized, and that's really not good for the state.
Yeah, I have a corollary to both of those things. I agree. I was going to say the media, but I think part of that is the Republicans have taken the Democrats' non-transparent way of operating government and taken it to a ridiculous extreme, which then I think, and done things in secret and the last minute, nobody knows what's happening. That ruins people's confidence in government even more, and it's a circle that doesn't serve any of us well.
Confidence. All good answers. Thank you. Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, give your feedback, and read my weekly column, visit our website, ncspin.com, or catch NC Spin on Facebook. And join us next week. We're going to have a special program. Treasurer Dale Falwell is going to be with us for balanced debate for the Old North State. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.
From treating the newest member of your family to helping a loved one make end-of-life decisions, your family physician is with you every step, for every stage of life, for every member of your family. Despite a healthcare landscape fraught with potential landmines, family physicians across North Carolina are providing you a lifetime of committed, dependable medical care. Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisor for life.
Agriculture. It's North Carolina's #1 economic driver. It puts people to work. It powers our economy. And as agriculture grows, so does our quality of life. North Carolina Farm Bureau is proud to support agriculture and our farmers because agriculture connects us all.
North Carolina Channel is made possible by the financial contributions of viewers like you who support the UNC TV network.